So if you want to overthrow a country today, you don't build an army, you build a podcast network.
Right.
And maybe a human resources department.
Right, yeah. You definitely don't buy tanks anymore.
No, exactly. I mean, usually when we think about taking over a massive fortified structure like a government or a whole society, we just naturally picture a frontal assault. Breaking down the doors, storming the gates.
Yeah, we default to that textbook definition of a revolution. Like the storming of the Bastille.
Right.
An event with a specific date that you can just memorize for a history test.
But when you actually look at how modern culture shifts, that whole siege metaphor just completely falls apart.
Right.
The takeover doesn't happen with armies at the gates.
No, not at all.
It happens with the people who write the kindergarten curriculums, the ones who code the corporate compliance policies, or who punch up the scripts for late-night comedy. So it isn't a siege. It's really a slow, quiet reprogramming of the operating system.
Yeah, it's the architecture of systemic capture. You don't defeat the enemy in battle. You slowly rewrite the rules of reality until the enemy doesn't even realize they've been conquered.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive. I am so excited for this one. Today, we're opening up a massive and honestly fascinating stack of sources that you shared with us.
It's a really intense collection of documents.
It really is. We're looking at highly detailed strategic memos, demographic research reports, and political playbooks that examine the literal mechanics of cultural dominance. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack exactly how ideologies spread, why throwing logical arguments at them almost always fails, and how the global political landscape is just fracturing in ways that will probably surprise you.
Yeah, we're getting under the hood to look at the specific blueprints being used to engineer these shifts in real time.
Now, before we pull all this apart, I need to set a crucial ground rule for this deep dive, directly for you listening. These sources contain highly politically charged material.
Highly charged.
Yes. Specifically, what we are analyzing today is essentially a center-right playbook. It's a set of documents analyzing and attempting to counter left-wing cultural strategies. So I need to make it absolutely clear that neither of us are taking sides here.
Right. We have no horse in this race.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints, and we aren't condemning them. Think of us as, like, anthropologists stumbling upon a tactical manual in a foreign country. Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the content and decode the fascinating strategies and psychological frameworks contained within these original texts.
We're basically dissecting the machinery of persuasion. We want to understand how the gears turn, regardless of who is actually pulling the levers.
Okay, so let's unpack this. To understand the political landscape we're all living in right now, the sources argue that we had to rewind almost a century. We have to look at the historical blueprint the left supposedly used to gain cultural dominance in the first place.
Yeah, this starts back in the 1930s with an Italian Marxist thinker named Antonio Gramsci.
Gramsci. But if I'm reading this right, Gramsci actually thought the original Marxist playbook was fundamentally broken, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He looked at the real world and realized the old theory just didn't match reality at all. I mean, the original Marxist expectation was that capitalist societies would inevitably face these violent worker-led revolutions.
Like Russia in 1917.
Exactly like that. The idea was the workers would realize they were being exploited, they'd rise up and just take over the factories. But Gramsci looked at Western liberal democracies and saw that this raw, violent revolution simply wasn't happening. And it likely never would.
Because the middle class was just too comfortable.
That's definitely part of it, yeah. But Gramsci dug a lot deeper into the actual mechanism of power. He realized that the ruling order in a Western democracy isn't maintained purely by force or police power. It's maintained by what he called cultural consent. The dominant worldview had been so thoroughly embedded into the everyday institutions of life, the schools, churches, media, the courts, that regular people just accepted that worldview as the natural order of the universe.
Wow. So it wasn't an ideology to them. It was just the way things are.
Exactly. Yeah. And he termed this cultural hegemony.
Okay, so if the public doesn't even recognize the water they're swimming in, you can't exactly declare war on the ocean. How did he propose fighting that?
Well, Gramsci argued for a war of position. If a war of maneuver is your violent frontal assault, a war of position is a slow, generational intellectual struggle. The goal is to systematically displace the dominant worldview from within its own institutions.
I see.
And to do this, he introduced the concept of the organic intellectual.
And in this context, an intellectual isn't just, a guy with elbow patches smoking a pipe in a dusty library. An organic intellectual is anyone who shapes the narrative.
Right. It could be a journalist,
An artist, a community organizer, or today, maybe an HR director running a diversity training.
Precisely. Gramsci realized you don't actually need to convince 51% of the voters to change society. You just need to capture the critical choke points where the cultural narrative is produced and distributed.
Wow.
If you change the people teaching the teachers, you eventually change the entire country.
It's like planting a garden instead of invading a country. I mean, it takes a generation to grow, but the roots are almost impossible to pull up once they're there.
It's a perfect analogy.
But, a theory is just words on paper until someone acts on it. How did this jump from a 1930s Italian prison notebook into modern Western institutions? Because the sources spend a lot of time on the Frankfurt School and critical theory.
Yeah, so the Frankfurt School was established in the 1920s in Germany, and they later relocated to the U.S., and they basically provided the theoretical arsenal for this long-term campaign.
Because traditional Marxism obsessed over economics and class struggle.
Right. But the Frankfurt School shifted the battlefield entirely to culture. Mass media, education, psychology, the family unit. And they developed critical theory, which is so crucial to understand here.
Yeah, let's define that, because it isn't just about being critical or complaining about things.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It is a specific analytical framework that views every human interaction and every societal structure exclusively through the lens of power dynamics and oppression.
So if you assume an institution was built by a powerful group specifically to maintain their own power, your only moral option is to dismantle it.
Exactly. And that framework was incredibly infectious. Herbert Marcuse, who was a philosopher from the Frankfurt School, he became sort of the intellectual godfather of the 1960s New Left.
Okay.
He endorsed a strategy famously articulated by a German student leader in 1967 named Rudi Dutschke. And Dutschke called it the long march through the institutions.
The long march.
Yeah. Dutschke argued that left-wing activists shouldn't just protest outside the system. Protesting is a war of maneuver. Instead, they should enter the universities, the media, the government bureaucracies, master how they work, and gradually transform them from the inside.
Which brings us to the 1968 Columbia University uprising. The sources highlight this as the massive watershed moment where the theory finally became reality.
A huge moment.
Yeah, radical students occupied buildings and essentially held the university hostage. But the analysis points out that the true impact wasn't actually what happened during that protest.
No, the real impact was what happened over the next 30 years, because those 1968 student protesters grew up.
Right.
They became the tenured professors, the media executives, the university administrators. They brought their ideological framework back into the very institutions they had previously tried to burn down.
That is wild.
According to the memos we're looking at, the biggest casualty of this march was the traditional concept of the university as a place for the disinterested, objective pursuit of truth. It was completely replaced by the idea that all knowledge is inherently political.
And therefore, education must be a tool for social activism.
Exactly.
Okay, so that explains the systemic capture. But I want to pivot to the individual, because understanding how a university department flips is one thing. But understanding how an ideology captures an individual human mind today is another.
It's a totally different mechanism.
Yeah, and the sources argue heavily that this modern battlefield is entirely psychological, not logical.
Oh, absolutely. The most powerful weapon deployed in this cultural march hasn't been empirical data. It has been identity architecture.
Identity architecture.
Yes. The strategy provides people, especially young people, with a hyper-clear moral identity. It offers a framework where you're automatically on the right side of history. You have a clear in-group of progressives and a clear out-group of oppressors. It makes a really chaotic world easily legible.
Because everything simply boils down to power dynamics.
Right.
And when someone adopts that identity, it seems like logic just bounces right off them. I mean, if you listening to this are arguing with your uncle at Thanksgiving and you show him a verified statistic that proves his political view wrong, he doesn't thank you and change his mind.
No, he usually gets furious.
Exactly.
And there's a reason for that. Ideological commitment activates a well-documented psychological mechanism called identity protective cognition.
Identity protective cognition.
Yeah. When a specific belief is deeply tied to your social group identity, presenting contradictory facts doesn't change your mind. It actually strengthens the original belief.
Wait, really? It strengthens it.
Yes, because the brain doesn't process the statistic as a piece of new information. It interprets the factual contradiction as a literal social attack on your survival within your tribe.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here. Because I'm looking at this stack of center-right memos. We're talking about thousands of pages of deeply logical, meticulously researched strategy, all dedicated to proving that logic doesn't work against ideology.
It's pretty funny when you put it like that.
Right. It's a massive paradox.
Yeah.
If emotion and identity are the only things that matter, why are they writing these hyperlogical white papers to combat it?
Well, it is a paradox, and the authors of these strategies are highly aware of it. They acknowledge that you cannot fight a moral emotion with a spreadsheet. So the white papers are essentially the blueprints to build a new emotional machine.
Oh, interesting.
The sources detail the emotional toolkit used in leftist political diffusion, which relies heavily on moral shock. So, framing everyday issues as existential crises of justice.
Okay.
And it uses targeted shame, directing guilt at the in-group by telling educated or white audiences they must constantly atone for structural privilege.
It also relies heavily on what the memos call language capture.
Right. Yes. Creating specialized terminology is a massive part of identity building. Think of academic terms that have bled into the mainstream, like microaggressions, heteronormativity, or structural privilege.
Right, you hear those everywhere now.
And these terms perform two functions simultaneously. First, using them signals to others that you belong to the educated, morally aware in-group.
Like a secret handshake?
Exactly. And second, they make outsiders feel illiterate, clumsy, and instantly defensive in a conversation.
I love the analogy we came up with for this. It's like trying to unlock a smartphone with a metal house key. I mean, the conservative argument is the metal key. Maybe it's a perfectly good key, but you have to speak the device's actual digital language to get inside.
That's a great way to put it.
So how does someone break through that? Because the sources bring in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory to explain exactly why conservative arguments usually fail to even register.
Yeah, Haidt's research basically provides the decoder ring for this language barrier. He found that across different cultures, human morality relies on roughly 6 intuitive foundations.
Okay, what are they?
They are care, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty. Now, through extensive psychological testing, he discovered that liberals primarily weigh just 2 of those foundations heavily, care and fairness.
Only 2.
Right. Conservatives, however, weigh all 6 relatively equally.
Okay, so if I'm translating this to the real world, this is exactly why political debates feel like 2 people speaking completely different languages.
Exactly. A conservative might argue against a policy using the language of loyalty to the nation or the sanctity of an institution. Think about the debate over kneeling during the national anthem.
Oh, sure.
To a conservative, that violates loyalty and sanctity. But to a progressive ear, tuned almost exclusively to care and fairness, an argument based on sanctity literally sounds like nonsense. Or worse, just a cover for malice.
Wow. So to unlock that smartphone, the right has to translate its policy goals entirely into the vocabulary of care and fairness.
Otherwise, the message is structurally rejected by the listener's brain before it's even processed.
That is fascinating. So if the left won through this incredible multi-generational institutional patience and emotional resonance, the sources outline how the right is currently attempting to reverse engineer this exact playbook.
Yeah, they literally call it the Gramscian, right?
The Gramscian.
Yeah. The most sophisticated strategists on the right have finally realized you cannot beat a 60-year institutional march with a 6-month election campaign. You have to turn Gramsci upside down and systematically build a counter-hegemony.
And that takes time.
Immense patience. You have to build parallel institutions.
So they aren't just trying to win the local school board anymore. I mean, if I'm looking at the examples in the text, like the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, the MCC in Hungary, they're essentially trying to build a rival Ivy League ecosystem from scratch.
Yes. MCC is a perfect example of transnational parallel institution building. They're heavily funded, expanding across Europe, and creating a pipeline for conservative organic intellectuals.
We see that here, too.
Oh, absolutely. In the U.S., you see this with the explosive growth of alternative educational models like Hillsdale College or the aggressive structural takeover of New College of Florida. They're also building independent legal advocacy groups designed to counter legacy organizations like the ACLU.
But building a university that carries real cultural weight takes decades. Where are they moving fast right now? Because the memos point to the podcast and independent creator ecosystem as their ultimate weapon.
Yeah, to completely bypass legacy media gatekeepers, this is where the Gramscian strategy gets hyper-modernized. Trust in traditional legacy media has essentially collapsed across the board.
Oh, completely.
So the right recognized this vacuum early and leaned heavily into unmediated, long-form audio and video. The research in your stack highlights a University of Sydney study analyzing Donald Trump's 2024 podcast strategy.
Right, where he heavily utilized massive platforms like Joe Rogan.
Exactly. And the study estimated that strategy alone boosted his support by 1 to 2.6%.
That is insane. I mean, in a margin of error election, that is an earth-shattering number.
It really is.
Why does that specific format work so well, though? Is it just the sheer size of the audience?
It's actually the psychological dynamic of the medium. Long-form, unscripted conversations build what psychologists call parasocial intimacy.
Parasocial intimacy.
Yeah. When a listener spends 3 hours in their earbuds listening to two people just talk, it bypasses those critical filters. It feels like you're getting the unfiltered truth from a trusted friend at a bar, rather than being lectured by some polished authority figure reading a teleprompter.
It completely circumvents the institutional gatekeeping the left spent decades building in legacy newsrooms.
Exactly.
And while they're building these new platforms, they are shamelessly borrowing the actual battle tactics of their opponents. I found the irony in this section just unbelievable.
Oh, it's incredibly ironic.
These conservative strategists are explicitly distributing and studying Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, which is, you know, the legendary seminal handbook for left-wing community organizers from the 1970s.
Yeah, they studied Alinsky and realized his tactics are entirely ideologically neutral.
They're just tools.
Right. They are simply the raw mechanics of power. The right is now heavily deploying Alinsky's rule that ridicule is man's most potent weapon.
Ridicule.
Yes. They've realized that making progressive ideology look absurd, often just by amplifying extreme clips on social media through memes, is vastly more effective than publishing a solemn 30-page logical rebuttal.
Which goes back to the emotion over logic thing.
Exactly. They are also utilizing his rule to pick a specific individual target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it, rather than attacking abstract bureaucratic systems.
Man, I want to dig into another tactic mentioned in the sources because it addresses that identity protective cognition we talked about earlier. Can you walk us through the mechanics of the inoculation or pre-bunking technique?
Oh, this is a fascinating psychological tactic.
Yeah. How does exposing someone to a weakened form of an argument actually build a psychological immune system?
Well, it functions exactly like a medical vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
We know from Cambridge University research that if you try to debunk a claim after someone has already adopted it as part of their identity, they just dig in.
Right, the Thanksgiving uncle effect.
Exactly. So pre-bunking intercepts them before the infection. You preemptively expose your audience to the structure of the rhetorical trick they are going to face.
Give me an example of how that works.
So a conservative commentator might tell their audience, next week, the media is going to try to make you feel personally guilty for a historical event by using this specific phrase.
Ah, I see.
You're teaching pattern recognition. When the listener finally encounters that exactly progressive argument in the wild, their brain doesn't get emotionally hooked by the shame.
Because they're expecting it.
Right. Instead, their brain says, oh, I know this trick, I was warned about this, and it instantly neutralizes the emotional payload.
Wow. Okay, so we've been deep in the trenches of this cultural warfare. And if you live in the West, this battle feels incredibly all-consuming.
It feels like everything.
It really feels like the entirety of human existence right now. But then the sources zoom out to look at the global demographic landscape, and they reveal a massive blind spot.
Yeah, this data provides a very necessary reality check. We treat this progressive versus conservative culture war as if it's the default state of human nature, but the demographic research proves it absolutely is not.
Not at all.
For roughly 5 billion people on Earth, the Western left-right ideological duality does not even exist.
Wait, 5 billion people are just sitting out the culture war?
They're operating on a completely different political geometry. If you look at China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East, politics is organized around entirely different axes.
Like what?
It's driven by religious sectarianism, tribal loyalty, anti-colonial nationalism, or economic clientelism.
Let's define that last one for clarity: economic clientelism.
Sure. That is a system where political loyalty is traded for direct, tangible goods or services, rather than ideological alignment. Think of it as, if my village votes for you, you guarantee a paved road and a new well for us.
So it's completely transactional.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with critical theory or moral foundations. In fact, the progressive agenda issues like gender fluidity or critical race frameworks is often actively rejected in the global South as just a brand new flavor of Western cultural imperialism.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, and in China, there is even a viral online term, baizuo, which roughly translates to white left.
White left.
Yeah, it's used as a highly derogatory shorthand to mock Western elites for their obsession with identity politics, framing it as pure cultural decadence.
Okay, so this intense ideological fracturing is very much a first world Western phenomenon. But even inside our own Western borders, the demographics are totally fracturing in ways that break all the old models.
Yeah.
The sources point out that the class inversion is now complete.
Yeah, this is a huge shift. For most of the 20th century, the political dividing lines were clear. The left was the party of the blue-collar working class,
Right.
and the right was the party of the wealthy, country club, professional elite. Well, that dynamic has entirely flipped.
Completely upside down.
The data shows the left now fundamentally represents the urban, educated professionals, the managerial class. Meanwhile, the populist right has absorbed the working class and those without college degrees. It is a massive structural realignment.
And that brings us to the most explosive new fault line the demographic data reveals. We always hear about the urban versus rural divide, or, the college versus non-college divide. But this gender gap among Gen Z feels totally unprecedented in history.
It really is.
Are young men and young women literally living in two completely different political realities right now?
They absolutely are. A massive 32-country European benchmark study, which is corroborated by similar data from the US, UK, and Brazil, shows a rapidly widening chasm.
Okay.
Young women between the ages of 18 and 30 are moving significantly to the political left, while young men in that exact same age bracket are moving significantly to the right.
What is the mechanism driving that specific wedge? I mean, it can't just be an accident.
It's a collision of economics and culture. Young women are graduating from university at much higher rates than men, which places them directly into those environments deeply steeped in the progressive ideologies we discussed earlier.
Right, the Long March institutions.
Exactly. And they've also been powerfully mobilized by cultural movements like Me Too, which provided a really strong, unifying political identity.
Okay, and what about the young men?
Young men, conversely, are facing a much more precarious, shifting labor market. But maybe more importantly, the core messaging of the modern left often frames traditional masculinity as inherently toxic or historically oppressive.
So we feel alienated.
Yeah. Many young men feel actively blamed by progressive messaging. As a result, they're increasingly drawn into alternative ecosystems like the male-dominated podcast networks we talked about earlier,
Right.
which offer them a sense of respect, traditional identity, and community. For the first time in modern polling history, young men and women are acting as direct cultural and political competitors.
That is just wild to think about.
It's not just a puzzle for election campaigns, it's a profound threat to future social cohesion.
Okay, let's step back and summarize the incredible journey we've just taken through this stack of sources. The core thesis here is that cultural dominance is not won through forceful takeover. It is won through generational, institutional patience, the Long March.
Exactly.
It's won by building deep emotional identity architectures, not by having the most bulletproof logical debate. The center-right has recognized this and is actively reverse engineering the playbook, building parallel institutions and massive creator networks to build a counter-hegemony.
A war of position.
Right. But importantly, this intense ideological war is largely a Western luxury, completely ignored by 5 billion people operating on different political operating systems entirely.
And, internalizing this playbook isn't just about understanding abstract political theory. It has immediate, profound applications for how you navigate the world.
Right. For you listening, understanding these mechanisms changes how you consume your daily news or listen to your favorite podcast. It changes how you decode the specialized language suddenly being used in your corporate HR compliance trainings.
Oh, definitely.
It even changes how you approach a heated political disagreement with a family member. It reminds you to look for the emotional identity and the moral foundations operating underneath the argument. It saves you from brutally fighting the facts and wondering why the other person simply refuses to listen.
You have to speak to the operating system, not the firewall.
That's perfect. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over long after this audio stops playing.
All right, let's hear it.
The sources highly praise these new unmediated podcasts and creator ecosystems as the ultimate weapon for bypassing legacy institutional gatekeepers.
Yeah, that's their whole strategy.
But think about the trajectory here. As these new platforms consolidate power, as they gain audiences in the tens of millions and become the primary news source for an entire generation, aren't they destined to simply become the new legacy institutions?
It is the iron law of institutions. Eventually, the disruptors harden into the establishment.
And when that happens, when the rebels become the new gatekeepers, will a brand new long march have to take place all over again?
Probably.
Maybe next time it won't be through university campuses or podcast networks, but through the metaverse. Or by quietly rewriting the base code of decentralized AI models. Because whether you're breaking down the firewall, storming the gates, or patiently rewriting the code, someone is always trying to hack the system.
The war of position never actually ends. It just changes battlefields.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.